happy to see all of you. I am absolutely honored and delighted to have Professor Sheldon Solomon with us. Sheldon Solomon is one of the most important scientists in the field of psychothanatology. Precisely, he is a social psychologist at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. He is best known for developing terror management theory along with Greenberg and Pisinski. This famous theory is focused on how humans deal with their own sense of mortality. He is the author of hundreds of articles and several books, among which The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death and in Life with Greenberg and Pisinski. And he has been featured in several films, among which Flight from Death, and documentaries, among which Planet of the Humans. This seminar is divided in 4 meetings. It is part of the initiatives of the Psychology of Death and Dying course, the project Death Education for Palliative Psychology, and the Master's Program in Death Studies and the End of Life. Today, Sheldon Solomon will talk about TMT, what it is and what its application scope is. Thank you so much, Sheldon.
Well, thank you, Ines, and hello, everyone. I feel like I'm speaking to you in a proverbial void, so I'm going to trust that you can hear me and that you can see the slides that are on the screen, and that this will be a somewhat satisfactory substitution for what I hope we would all prefer, and that's to be in the same physical space. And I look forward, I hope in the not too distant future, for us to be able to do that. It is my pleasure to tell you a little bit about the work that I do with Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pisinski on terror management theory. And what I had in mind for today is to just give you a general overview of the theory, as well as the basic research paradigms. We'll see how that goes time-wise, and we'll do a little bit in terms of applications, but I think that that will carry over into tomorrow, where we'll do applications, and I will update you on where the theory, as well as the research, the status of it in the present moment. And that will then next week allow us to expand a bit, primarily into clinical and more broadly existential matters. So I see this week as basically theory and research. Next week as more specifically devoted to clinical applications. All right, so very quickly, let's just start, if I can figure out how to get my own slides going. Let's just start by recalling just what the nature of psychology is. Everyone knows that ology is the study of, and psyche typically viewed as the mind, but actually in the original Greek, psyche means soul. And Aristotle described the soul as the essence of a natural body that's imbued with life. And he said, well, what does that mean? And he went on to say, well, if an axe was alive, then the soul of an axe would be to chop. And if an eyeball were alive, then the soul of an eyeball would be to see. If a woodpecker were alive, then the soul of a woodpecker would be to peck, and a grasshopper, the soul would be to hop, and you get the point. But that shifts the question to, okay, what is the essence of being a human being? And of course, the answer to that question depends on who you might ask. Aristotle viewed us as rational creatures. Homo sapiens means to be wise. Other folks think that we're uniquely playful creatures. Ludens means to play in Latin. Other folks, Hannah Arendt, coined the term homo faber, that we're tool-making creatures. Another view is that we're fundamentally aesthetic creatures, that we live by more than rationality alone. Another view is that we're storytelling creatures. And my view is that all of those are wonderful depictions of the human animal. They all serve to draw our attention to aspects of our humanity that are surely quintessential in some ways and therefore worthy of our collective cogitation. But the work that I do is based on another notion. And it's one that was, I think, very eloquently articulated by a Scottish author, Alexander Smith, who said in an essay in 1863, "It is our knowledge that we have to die that makes us human." And William James, the great American philosopher who wrote the first book, Principles of Psychology, the first psychology book, that is, he referred to death as the worm at the core of the human experience. But the direct influence of our work was the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, who won a Pulitzer Prize in 1973 for the book, The Denial of Death, where he takes that basic idea, it is our knowledge that we have to die that makes us human, and he amplifies it through both an evolutionary as well as an existential psychodynamic lens in order to generate a comprehensive account of the motivational underpinnings of human behavior. All right, so let's very quickly go through and see what Becker had in mind. And in one of his earliest books, The Birth and Death of Meaning, Becker says, I want to understand what makes people act the way they do, a fundamentally motivational question. And what he says is, before we even start, let's think about the epistemological assumptions required for this kind of ambitious endeavor. And he said, look, it's going to have to be interdisciplinary, that the reality of the human condition transcends the boundaries of any particular academic discipline, and we need to consider all of them. And Becker's work is very rich in psychology, in philosophy, sociology, religion, literature, popular culture. So on the one hand, he felt very strongly that we need to seriously entertain ideas regardless of their origin. On the other hand, while he said we all have the right to express our ideas and our opinions, it doesn't follow from that all opinions are equal. So while he was not a researcher himself, he recognized the ultimate importance of subjecting our ideas to empirical scrutiny. Moreover, he comes from the Enlightenment tradition that emphasized the use of knowledge towards practical ends, that we could take what we learn about ourselves and make good use of it, both in terms of fostering personal growth as well as social progress. And then finally, he said, it would behoove us to embed our ideas in an evolutionary framework, given that Darwin's theory of evolution is perhaps the most potent and most long-standing theory currently in scientific discourse. All right, and so with that in mind, he says, let's start with Darwin. Let's ask how humans are similar to, as well as uniquely different than, all other forms of life. And he says, following Darwin, we're pretty much like all other living things. We're biologically predisposed to stay alive in the service of survival and reproduction. And there's a sense in which, following Aristotle, that all things that are alive have minds, to the extent that anything alive respond systematically to the demands of its surroundings. Right? But humans are different. We have complex minds. And Becker defines complexity in terms of what he calls freedom of reactivity, the extent to which an organism's behavior is tied to a particular stimulus. So real quickly, an amoeba has a mind, but it's a very simple one, because for any given stimulus, it either approaches it or it avoids it, depending upon whether or not it's pleasant or not. The dog has the capacity to be classically conditioned. You can ring a bell that a dog has never heard before, which means nothing to it at the time. But if you keep ringing the bell while you give the dog food, eventually the dog will salivate, as Pavlov famously discovered, just from the sound of the bell. So now here you are, a neutral stimulus that acquires meaning. It is imposed by the mind of the organism. You've got the chimp capable of learning by insight, but let's just get to the chase. Human beings are the ultimate in terms of cognitive complexity because of our unique combination of being able to think abstractly and symbolically. And we, in fact, are so sophisticated that we can imagine something that doesn't even exist and then have the audacity to transform our dreams into reality. As you can see, Da Vinci's sketches of helicopters in the 1500s, dismissed as the doodlings of a madman, and yet here we are today, routinely transported by them. Well, one of the things that is a result of our cognitive complexity is that we're so smart that we realize that we're here. And if we had the joy of being together today, I would ask all of you to think about, was there a point in your life where you realized that you were you? There's a big literature in this domain, and for some people, it's a gradual realization. For myself, it was like Emily in the little description that we're looking at here. I was sitting around one day in the park in the Bronx, where I grew up in New York, and I was like, wait a minute, I'm here. Well, according to Kierkegaard, the fact that we're here, which we take for granted, should not be, because only humans have the cognitive complexity to make us the object of our own subjective inquiry. And in Kierkegaard, in a book called Fear and Trembling, he said, look, if you know that you're here, then you're going to experience two uniquely human emotions that he called awe and dread. All right, let's get to the good news, and let's not forget the good news anytime during our time together, and that is that it is great to be alive. Otto Rank, who was one of Freud's disciples, who Becker admires a great deal, he said that self-consciousness makes us the temporal representative of the cosmic primal force. Right, now, that may seem like an obscure statement, but if we unpack it for a moment, as Rank does, he says, look, the cosmic primal force, that's living thing number one. And we are all the spawn. We are all the offspring of the first thing that ever lived. We are indirectly, but nevertheless related to everything that is ever been alive and everything that's now been alive. And in our finest moments, Kierkegaard and Becker argue, we just love the fact that we're alive. On the other hand, unless you're a child or an idiot, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're also smart enough to know that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration, and that you too will someday die, that you can die at any time for reasons that you can't anticipate or control, and that you're an animal, that you're inextricably connected to your physical carcass that, like all living things, will age and ultimately die and decay. All right, the result, according to Ernest Becker, is existential terror. The idea, very simply, is that human beings would not be able to stand up in the morning if they were always aware of the reality of the human condition. All right, I'm gonna die. I can walk outside and get hit by a meteor, or I can get exterminated by a virus, or somebody that's just upset in my country and starts shooting guns in grocery stores. And this raises the question of how is it that human beings were able to manage the terror that is engendered by the uniquely human awareness of death. And so this is where we came up with what we call terror management theory, which is just our effort to take Becker's ideas and to frame them in theoretical terms so that we can use them to derive hypotheses that we could subject to empirical scrutiny. And so this is just a summation of what we've already learned so far, más o menos, because what Becker goes on to say is that the way that we manage existential terror is through the formation and maintenance of culture. Becker uses the term cultural worldviews, which he defines as humanly created beliefs about the nature of reality that we share with other people in our culture. And that this manages existential terror by giving us each a sense that life has meaning and we have value. Right, so very important for Becker and for terror management theory is the idea of meaning and value. And so Becker goes on, he says, look, culture gives us meaning. It gives us an account of the origin of the universe. It gives us a prescription for how we're expected to behave while we're here. It gives us the hope of immortality, either literally the heavens, the souls, the afterlives of all the world's great religions, or symbolically. You might realize that you won't be here forever, but you're comforted by the prospect that a vestige of your existence will persist over time. Nonetheless, maybe by having children, maybe by amassing a great fortune, maybe by designing or constructing a great work of art or science. The point for Becker and for terror management theory is that absolutely necessary for a sense of psychological well-being is the belief that life has meaning. Necessary but not sufficient, because in addition to the belief that life is meaningful, we also, Becker submits, need to believe that we're valuable participants in that meaningful universe. And here is the sociologists tell us that every culture has different social roles, and every social role has certain standards. And if you meet or exceed those standards, well, then you get to believe that you're a person of value in a world of meaning. And if you feel that way, that's what Becker calls self-esteem, the belief that you're a person of value in a world of meaning. And what terror management theory goes on to stipulate, following Becker, is that because people are motivated to maintain faith in their culturally constructed beliefs and confidence in their self-worth, that's basically whether we're aware of it or not, and mostly we're not. Most of our waking moments are devoted to preserving the integrity of what we call the dual component anxiety buffering system that consists of cultural worldviews and self-esteem. And what we posit is that when any of those structures are threatened, that will instigate a host of compensatory reactions. All right, let's just keep going a bit and see how it is that that all of this unfolds over time developmentally. Because what we argue is that terror management is basically a symbolic extrapolation of the anxiety buffering qualities of infant attachment, and that this unfolds in the context of socialization. All right, we know that humans are born profoundly immature and dependent and are therefore prone to anxiety. And we know John Bowlby told us that long before babies have any awareness of themselves, let alone the awareness of death, that they are highly anxious in situations where there's danger or there are needs that are not adequately addressed. John Bowlby called this raw, undifferentiated terror. And what he argued is that that is the psychological impetus for the formation of attachment that happens in all infants, even if it is non-optimal. Well, now what Becker goes on to propose is that, okay, but eventually you have to be socialized. You have to be incorporated into your social milieu by learning the language and the beliefs and traditions of that milieu. And in order for this to happen, parental affection becomes increasingly contingent on children behaving in appropriate ways. And anyone who has children has probably found this out, that when your child does the right thing, you praise them. And when children are being praised, this gives them the same feelings of psychological well-being that is previously associated with being securely attached. But when you do something wrong that's culturally inappropriate, well, that begets a very different reaction. Your parents may punish you. They may just not be overly happy. And it is the absence of affection that engenders anxiety. And the point for Becker is that over time, children associate being good with being safe and being bad with being unsafe. And it is in this fashion that self-esteem becomes a very potent anxiety buffer. But now let's see how we get from attachment to the parents to attachment to the culture. And let's note that over time, the anxiety buffering qualities of self-esteem come to depend not so much on pleasing our parents, although that's still part of it, but it ultimately depends on pleasing our culture. And psychodynamically, this tradition is initiated as kids become increasingly aware of death, first of those around them, and then of themselves. And we'll talk more about this next week, I suspect, but in Yalom's book on existential psychotherapy is a chapter about childhood and death that demonstrates that kids are very much concerned about existential matters early on. All right, well, as kids become aware that their parents are mortal and fallible, as they become aware of the inevitability of their own demise, there's a shift in the basis or locus of self-worth from the parents to the culture. And once that is in place, here we are as, quote, functional adults who manage existential terror by trying to maintain our beliefs, our self-worth, and our close relationships with significant others. All right, so let's transition and let's talk a little bit about the extent to which any of this is true. Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for the denial of death, and yet he couldn't get a job, and most academic psychologists did not take these ideas seriously. And the argument at the time was that this was basically speculative nonsense, in that even if the ideas were interesting, and most people granted that they were, what academic psychologists said is, yeah, but there's no evidence for these ideas. Moreover, it wouldn't be possible to provide evidence for them because the ideas come from philosophy, come from religion, and they hypothesize unconscious mental processes. Right, so here's where we come in. And because we are and were experimental social psychologists, and we said, okay, let's see what we can do. So for almost 40 years now, starting with Jeff and Tom and I, and then our students, and now a boatload of very able people around the world, including folks that work with Ines and that I have worked with at the University of Padova. There's now well over 1,000 published studies based on the paradigms that we developed 30 or so years ago to test basic assumptions of the theory. All right, so somewhat quickly, let's talk about what we call self-esteem as anxiety buffer. And what the first line of inquiry was just to establish that Ernest Becker was on the right track when he said that self-esteem functions to buffer anxiety. And our thought was, well, okay, if he's right, then if we increase somebody's self-esteem, or if it's fairly high to begin with, that should reduce anxiety in response to subsequent threats. All right, now in the interest of time, I'm going to tell you about two experiments, and then I'm going to actually bounce through some more detailed slides that you can look at your time that just give you a little bit more methodological detail. But the point is, actually, we can do this, and I'll still have plenty of time to make it through my tirade. The first thing that we did was to raise self-esteem and to expose people either to a threatening or non-threatening situation, and then to measure self-reported anxiety. So we gave people either neutral or enhanced feedback on a bogus personality test. And then we had some of them watch 7 minutes of a neutral film about nature. Then we had people watch 7 minutes of a brutal film that was meant to be stressful, of an autopsy and a guy being electrocuted. And then we measured anxiety. We did a manipulation check, and that established that the self-esteem manipulation worked. All right, and then we measured anxiety. All right, and so we found if your self-esteem was unaltered and you watched movies of somebody being electrocuted, well, then you reported a lot of anxiety. And this just shows that the manipulation of the threat was successful. So we manipulated self-esteem, we manipulated threat. So the real question is, what happens to anxiety when you're watching a stressful film if your self-esteem has been raised? And the answer is that it remains low. All right, very promising, but not particularly compelling, because after all, this was a self-report measure. So we replicated this study. We used a different manipulation for self-esteem. We used a different threat manipulation, and we used a different dependent measure, this time physiological reactions to physical stimuli. So we raised self-esteem by giving people bogus feedback on an IQ assessment. Now we told people they were either going to watch colored lights or they were going to receive painful electrical shocks. And we measured autonomic arousal now in the form of skin conductance. All right, once again, manipulation check was successful. Once again, threatening people with electrical shock made them uber aroused. Now the question is, what happens when you raise self-esteem? Well, this time arousal was increased, but it was significantly lower than if self-esteem had been left unaltered. All right, there's dozens more studies along these lines, but the point is that we know that self-esteem serves as an anxiety buffer. All right, next up, and maybe most important for a lot of the work that we'll be doing together, and that's what we call the mortality salience hypothesis or hypotheses. And now the question is, how do we know that your beliefs about reality diminish death anxiety? And our thought is that if Becker is right, if terror management theory is right, then let's remind some people of their own mortality. We're going to call that mortality salience. And what we hypothesized is that when you're reminded of your own death, that should make you psychodynamically cling more tenaciously to your culturally constructed beliefs. And we should be able to determine that by measuring your agreement with and affection for those who either share your beliefs or who are opposed to them or merely different from them. So to put that another way, reminders of death should engender what we call worldview defense in the form of exaggerated positive evaluations of similar others and negative evaluations of different ones. And the way that we do this in our studies typically is by inserting two open-ended questions in what is purported to be a study of the relationship between personality and interpersonal judgments. And you can see, please briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your own death arouse in you, and jot down as specifically as you can what you think will happen to you as you physically die. Right, in a control condition, it's either something neutral about watching television or eating lunch. Better controls are negative but not fatal experiences, being in pain, being humiliated, having your leg cut off. Right, and so in the first and in some sense still one of the most interesting and poignantly profound studies, what we found is that municipal court judges in Tucson, Arizona, who were reminded of their mortality, they were 9 times as punitive in response to a moral transgression than were judges in a control condition. All right, so when we reminded judges that they were going to die, and then we asked them to set a monetary penalty for an alleged prostitute, after being reminded of death, they set up a penalty that was 9 times higher. And not a single judge was willing to admit that being reminded of their mortality would in any way have altered their judicial outcome. Well, that basic finding has been replicated numerous times. It has also been replicated demonstrating that your reaction to, in this case, alleged prostitution in the wake of a mortality salience induction, that depends on your attitude about prostitution to begin with. Right? In accord with terror management theory, if you don't believe prostitution to be a problem, then death reminders should not increase your reaction to that particular reputed transgression. And that's indeed what we found. Moreover, these reactions are very much confined to worldview threatening notions. And so if you ask participants in these studies to evaluate the experimenter as well as the moral transgression, The death reminders increase punitive reactions, but they don't result in a more negative evaluation of the experimenter, establishing that these effects are very much targeted. Right, but they're not only negative. And so if you remind somebody that they're going to die and you ask them to set a monetary reward for a heroic or pro-social behavior, well, what we find is that mortality salience increases those propensities. All right, so other ways of manipulating mortality. Sometimes we use mortality salience, rather. We use death anxiety scales, exposure to gory videos, being interviewed in front of a funeral parlor. What I feel is in some ways the most subtle and sophisticated way to manipulate mortality salience is when we're back in the lab and people are reading on a computer. And while they do that, we flash the word death for 28 milliseconds or dead so fast that you don't even know that death is on your mind. And the point, and we will have lots more to say about mortality salience tomorrow and the rest of our time together. But for the most part, every one of the effects that we will talk about upcoming can be produced by any of these manipulations of mortality salience. All right, gonna try one more paradigm and then we'll stop and we'll see how we're doing and do some questions and exchange some ideas. And this is what's called death thought accessibility. And this is kind of the flip side of mortality salience. And so the mortality salience hypothesis is that if you remind somebody that they're going to die, they will cling more tenaciously to their cultural beliefs. They will also strive more ardently for self-esteem. Now, in a different paradigm, we turn that idea around and we say, well, if cultural worldviews and self-esteem serve to manage existential terror, well, then if we threaten somebody's cultural beliefs, or if we undermine somebody's self-esteem, well, that should in principle increase what we call the accessibility of implicit death thoughts. All right, that just means how readily thoughts of death come to mind, even if you're unaware that they're there. All right, and death thought accessibility, we typically use a word stem completion task. I say that we borrowed this from Dan Gilbert, but I don't know if that's actually true. We got some other things from Dan. But anyway, imagine that you're asked to make words from these fragments. And let's note that if you've got COFF and you've just passed a cafe, you might say coffee. If you've just passed a cemetery, you might say coffin. Same with all of these other words. You can complete them with words that have death connotations, or they can be completed with other more neutral words. Right. And basically what we did was we gave people, we exposed people subliminally to the word death or field for 42 milliseconds. And then we asked them to complete a bunch of these word stems, where 8 of them can be completed with death-related words. And what we found is that the participants that were subliminally exposed to the word death, they completed more death-related words. All right, all that means is that this is a valid measure. When you flash the word death so fast that nobody can see it, it increases the accessibility of death-related words, even though people are unaware of having seen anything. All right, so what do we know? Christian fundamentalists who read an essay describing logical inconsistencies in the Bible, well, they had increased death thought accessibility. Canadians who read an essay mocking Canada, they had increased death thought accessibility. Atheists who read an essay suggesting that Jesus may have actually existed, they had increased death thought accessibility, Americans asked to reflect on their undesired self also had increased death thought accessibility. All right, so what we're going to do in a second is, well, I will shut up momentarily after I just tell you that all of these paradigms have been systematically juxtaposed with each other. All right, and so we know that mortality salience increases death thought accessibility after a while, and self-esteem striving. We know that when death thought accessibility is raised, that it produces the same effect as our typical death reminders. And we know, as it should be, that if your self-esteem is elevated, that reduces worldview defense, as well as death thought accessibility in response to mortality salience. All right, so I think what we're going to do is to have me stop, if that's okay, Ines, because what we will do next is to apply these ideas more broadly to a variety of areas of inquiry that Becker was concerned about, and that I hope we are all interested in. All right, to put this another way, the next question for us will be, so what? What is it that we can? What is it that these ideas, or how is it that these ideas can help us understand aspects of human behavior that would be difficult or impossible to comprehend otherwise? So just to anticipate where we will head, we're going to talk about how these ideas can help us understand prejudice and ethnic conflict. We're going to use these ideas to understand why in times of historical upheaval, we tend to support charismatic and populist political leaders. We're going to use this to understand why we don't like the idea that we're animals, and why it is that we have a tendency to ignore the environmental problems that will render the earth unfit for human habitation. We're going to try and use these ideas to understand why most people are addicted to shopping and money, and why whenever there are difficult historical moments like the ones that impinge upon us right now, that all forms of psychological dis-ease, put a hyphen between dis and ease. I don't want to medicalize psychological difficulties, but I think a lot of the prevailing individual as well as social difficulties that most of us are now encountering are better understood with the addition of these ideas. And to put that another way, and I do think that this is important, Becker never claimed, nor does terror management theory, that death anxiety is the sole cause of everything, because it is people, myself included, we are psychologically oriented towards trying to explain things, and not surprisingly, we want simple explanations for complex phenomenon. And so one way to think about Becker and terror management theory is these people are saying that everything you do is determined by death anxiety. And that's not the point. There are lots of factors that contribute to human behavior. The point is that any effort to understand human affairs writ large that attempts to do so without considering the role of existential anxieties, I would submit is doomed to fail. All right, so with that in mind, I hope that a little bit of this made sense. I'll stop now and let's talk.
Oh, thank you so much, Sheldon. Everything is absolutely interesting, important, and I think that there are lots of answers. Georgiana, Nicola, Erica, Silvia, Gianmarco, please, if you want to present the answers of our group of researchers.
Hello, I'm Nicola, and I'm doing my internship with the Professor Testoni. And I have a question from Luca Patriarca. What was the impact of your theory on the American and European academic landscape? How was the theory received and by the psychological and medical world? Did they oppose the theory or did they help develop it? Also, did you notice any differences between the American landscape and the European one regarding TMT?
Wow, thank you, Nicola.
Sorry for
And Professor. Wow. So, I mean, to be silly, but not, our theory was not welcomed in the United States. In fact, for the most part, people were either militantly indifferent or openly contemptuous. And I'll spare you the details, except that in 1980-ish, when we started developing the theory, social psychologists were moving in away from big theories and away from theories of motivation. Well, it was more towards very specialized theories based on cognitive approaches. And so we were kind of moving in a different direction, and psychology in North America has gone to great lengths to pretend that it's science by distancing itself from its philosophical and theological precursors. So no one would publish our work. It took about 8 years, I think, for us to get our work published. So in that sense, it was unwelcome. All right. Having said that, though, the medical world welcomed us before the psychology world. And so one of the first people to become aware of our work and to encourage us in the 1980s was Dr. Balfour Mount, and he invented palliative care at McGill University. And so in the 1980s, when we were young and kind of ambitious, and the psychologists were saying, "Oh, this is stupid, don't do it," Dr. Mount said, "This is important, and these ideas have tremendous implications for palliative care, as well as the behavior of medical practitioners who might themselves respond to existential anxieties by varying the way that they treat the people that they're responsible for caring for." All right. Big difference, though, between American and European reactions, because folks in Europe and Israel were much more favorably responsive much earlier than on our side of the world. And so the first terror management research lab, it turns out, was not in the United States. It was at Bar Ilan University in Israel, where Mario Mikulincer and Victor Florian and Gilad Hirschberger, they started doing work based on terror management theory, connecting it to attachment theory. It's some of the best work, I think. And other scholars in Europe, in Germany, and then subsequently in England, Ireland, then France and Italy, other folks, they were much more receptive. And I mean this as a compliment, because I believe that in Europe, there you are better educated in the sense of being more broadly aware of academic disciplines beyond the one that you're working in. And European scholars were not put off by talking about Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Levinas in the same sentence where we were talking about experiments. And so that's a long-winded response, but that would be my reaction to that question, which is a real good one.
Oh, thank you so much, Sheldon. It's absolutely significant, your answer to this question. But we think that the success of the terror management theory is getting wider and wider, because it is necessary to know this theory, especially for all psychologists. So thank you so much for your reflection and your work. There are already other two answers in our chat. I don't know. I think it could be interesting to read also this answer. Silvia, could you possibly read?
Yes. So there is one question that says, have the experiments also been made with people who are about to die and found peace with the thought of death and not fighting to survive? Can this apply also to the terror management theory, like suicidal people who are about to die? It would be interesting to know if there would also be a connection with self-esteem.
Yes. So thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, whoever posed the question. Actually, at least two good questions, maybe more than that. The short answer is yes and no, that there is some work now. One of Tom Pazinski's students, Molly Maxfield, who is a professor at Arizona State University, she's been at the vanguard of looking at reactions to mortality salience in elderly populations. And it was based on Erik Erikson's ideas about his 8 stages of man. If you were around today, hopefully he'd include the rest of the human race. But the last stage of life, Erikson described as a psychological fork in the road between despair and ego integrity. And he was like, yes, some people, as they get closer to dying, become more angry and fearful. Other people become more like Gandhi in terms of their apparent psychological equanimity and even enhanced well-being. And what Molly has found so far is that that's what appears to be happening, that some elderly folks, when they're reminded that they're going to die, they become more defensive and hyper-punitive. Other folks become more benevolent and benign, which of course raises the question of how do we know in advance which way people might go? So far, Molly has found that, and this may seem somewhat counterintuitive, but it has a lot to do with intact executive control, that people who are more neurologically intact, they appear to be the ones who are more benevolent or benign in response to mortality salience later in life. Your other point, though, or question, Sylvia, was about suicide. And suicide is the mother lode or cement necklace of every psychological theory. You know, starting with Darwin, we like to stay alive. So why are we undermining our own self-preservation instinct? I would submit without being expert. No, I'm expert enough to know that we just don't know enough about suicide. Now, we have a chunk of a chapter in our book, The Worm at the Core, where we take a shot at a terror management analysis of suicide. We also have some students that are working in this area, but I hope it's obvious why some of the obvious things that one might do research-wise are troubling. So I have a very talented student who reading about this work, she said, yeah, let's get some suicidal people in and let's do some subliminal death primes and see if their suicidal ideation goes up. To which I replied, I had no interest in spending the rest of my life in jail. In other words, interesting question, but the most obvious things that we might want to inquire about with regard to testing some of these possibilities are difficult. And we're gonna run into this tomorrow when I describe studies of clinical populations where we remind them of our mortality. And then we can wonder about some of the ethical conundrums that this produces. Anyway, fine questions.
Oh, thank you so much. There are a lot of answers in our chats. Georgiana, could you possibly? Thank you.
I have the following question. Could you tell something more about the people's attitude and behavior to the climate and ecological crisis we are living? Scientists say something like that we have 10 years left and it's a bad news for humanity. What does the
we couldn't listen.
Yeah, I lost the last part of the question, Georgia.
Oh, can you hear me?
I heard you fine
Yeah.
until the last part of the question.
So what can the TMT says about it, about the crisis climate that we are currently living in?
Well, so a lot of this, let me talk a little bit and then defer some of these conversations until next week after we've gotten through a little bit more territory. And I say that in part because these questions are substantial and too important to be cavalier about. What I mean by that is as follows. So basically, terror management theory says that, you know, when we're reminded of death, that we will embrace our current belief system. And so in the United States, what you believe about climate change depends on your political affiliation. Didn't used to be, but right now, if you want to know what somebody thinks about the climate in the next decade, you need to know who they voted for in the last election. Because if they voted for Donald Trump, then they don't believe in climate change or viruses or reading or anything. But I'm being silly, but not. Other people who did not support President Trump, they're very concerned about climate change. Now, based on that, and we did a study last year, we haven't published it because we didn't replicate it yet, but we got folks who either voted for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and we reminded them of their mortality, and then we asked them, is climate change a problem? And, what should we do about it? And most of the effects that we found were on the Trump supporters, because basically when you reminded them that they were going to die, they saw climate change as less of a problem, and that was less caused by human activity. And we're going to we have to talk more about this in the days to come, because, we're going to want to talk about the COVID pandemic. And so it's the same logic, though, in the United States, where if you support former President Trump, then you don't believe in a virus, and you don't believe in masks, and you don't believe in social distancing. And we're doing studies now where we're predicting that if you support President Trump, former President Trump, and you're reminded that you're going to die, then you'll take off your mask and stand closer to people, because that's their world view. And so ironically, people who support President Trump, when reminded of their death, will do stuff more likely to kill them. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Gianmarco. Could you possibly read the other two questions? And so, Nicola and Silvia, the questions we prepared.
Yes, of course. So I think that we missed the question of Giulio De Pasquale. That says, I immediately noticed the similarities between the unconscious word stimuli technique used in terror management theory, related research, and in social psychology research on stereotypes and prejudice accessibility. Does this have any significance on links between self-categorization and terror management?
I think it is better you read also the second question, Gianmarco, so Professor Solomon can resume everything.
Oh, the second question, I think, is the one that was already read, I think.
Okay.
The one of Matteo, yes. So I only see these two questions. Is the one that Georgiana I've already read. So okay. I think we miss only this one, this question of Giulio.
Oh, that's a great question. My short answer is yes. And we will, by the way, everybody that has questions or not, feel free to write to me, email or write to me anytime, so that we can continue some of these conversations. One of our students, now a professor, Jeff Schimmel at the University of Alberta, has done lots of studies, and I've been a collaborator on some of them, where we try and interface terror management theory with the discourses on social norms and social categories. And what I can say broadly is that in accord with terror management theory and maybe other views of these matters, that mortality salience increases the tendency to categorize in stereotypic ways.
So thank you. Can we start with our question, Silvia? I don't know, Silvia or Georgiana.
Sure. I have a following question from Francesco Rossellini. If it's true that having self-esteem and cultural belonging reduces anxiety and the fear of death, it can also be true that the lack of these two components might lead a person to not fear death, to not worry about it, because someone who does not have these components has nothing to lose. Thank you.
Yeah, no, fine question. And if I understand it, I think it's a question that goes back to antiquity, because the Epicureans were the ones who said, I don't see what everyone's worrying about. They said that the fear of death and the groping for self-esteem. Lucretius had all of these ideas. Terror management theory was started by him back in the day, because his point is that it is death anxiety that drives us to embrace our culture and to grope for self-esteem. But he's like, that makes no sense, because none of us are overly concerned about the fact that there were millions of years that happened before us. You know, it's like there's how many millions, if not billions of people are already dead. And that doesn't bother me a bit. But the idea that Earth can continue to exist for even a minute after I die, that's like unacceptable. And anyway, Lucretius, his point, or it might have been Epicurus, it really doesn't matter. But his point is like, yeah, it makes no sense. It should not concern us if we had no cultural constructs or self-esteem. But the point that Ernest Becker makes and that we make is that, yeah, it's people have never, in fact, behaved in that fashion. I don't know if that's a satisfactory response, because on the one hand, I agree that the almost lack of those things, culture and self-esteem, should lead us to not fear death. Now, I'm being a little coy because I was hoping to save this for next week, but I'll give you the punchline and then we'll come back to it. And that is that self-esteem and culture can be disposed of, but not leaving us in a psychodynamic void. That if in place of culture and self-esteem, we kind of go in the Buddhist direction and think in terms of gratitude and humility, if we're infused with those affectations, then we can get on fine without culture and self-esteem. And I'll talk about that next week extensively, I hope.
Oh, thank you. Now there is a question really interesting from Benjamin. But also I want to ask you the relationship between terror management theory and death education. I think, and there are lots of scholars who are convinced that it could be really interesting that death education courses include contents of terror management theory. What do you think about it?
I think that that's a good point. That might, it's ultimately an empirical question, Ines, and but I have talked with and worked with some death education programs, and yeah, so the question is, and there is a research team, I believe, studying this now, and that's what's the effect of being exposed to terror management theory. Is this something that can be useful in those contexts? And I'm gonna, and my view is I don't know, because when I teach terror management theory at my school, and at the end of the semester, you know, the students have to write evaluations about their courses. They usually say, thank you and fuck you. Thank you for raising these interesting ideas that have divested me of the comfortable illusion that I had any clue about the underpinnings of human behavior. And it will take me some time to recover from the perturbation these notions. I know I'm being a little silly, but the point is that I'm not sure how these ideas affect people, or to put it another way, I do think they're important ideas, and I think they should be included in educational settings from a very early age, but it doesn't mean that people like me should go into nursery schools where our children have diapers still to tell them that they're all going to die, like I told you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we can read the last question. I don't know who, Nicola, do you have to read it? The last, it is the last, Sheldon, we are finished.
Shall I read the last one I have? I think Sylvia has one more too. So it's, shall I read or do you want to, Sylvia? Okay.
Go ahead, yes.
In your opinion, should we aim to eliminate the fear of death, or rather, should we learn how to handle and channel it to fuel human creativity? How could this be accomplished?
Oof. Okay, again, great question. And other people have heard me talk about this, but I'm always too silly. I'm like, if I could answer that question, I would be drinking rum out of a coconut on the beach with my Nobel Prize, because it's a really important question. All right, I'll respond to it quickly and hope we come back to it next week when we're in the clinical domain. At the theoretical level, no, I don't think the fear of death ought to be eliminated, nor could it be. Basically, to eliminate the fear of death would be to try and offset 6 billion years or whatever of evolution. The most basic biological imperative is to not die prematurely. And any creature that was devoid of fear of death would be rapidly eliminated from the gene pool. So if you were a little baby and your parents were going out and they forgot about you for a couple of days and you had no anxiety, well, you might be relaxed, but you'd also be dead. And so anxiety, while unpleasant, is highly adaptive. And moreover, and I like this question because the second part of it, should we learn how to handle it to fuel human creativity? Well, that's an important question. And I suggest we defer because we have research on this topic. We know that death reminders increase the yearning for creativity. It also increases guilt, however, which raises the question of how we can use it to fuel human creativity. Again, I'm being a little coy here, but we'll come back to it. And so to just give you a hint, we can use death anxiety to fuel creativity without causing downstream adverse psychological consequences if the creativity has an explicit social goal. So if in the context of being individually creative, we also have a sense that we want to share the products of our creations with others, then that's the best of both worlds. But I very much like the idea of not trying to obliterate death anxiety, but rather to learn how to come to terms with it in a way such that it brings out the best in us. I think that's a great way to put it.
Oh, thank you so much. Now I think it is a good thing to finish everything, our meeting, and we will meet tomorrow at 2:30 Central Europe time. Thank you so much, Sheldon, for your fantastic talk, and also for your answers to our questions. But there are also 4 or 5 questions we aren't able to consider this afternoon. We will consider tomorrow if you want. I think the best thing, Silvia, is to resume all the questions we received and to present these themes tomorrow to Professor Sheldon Solomon. So thank you so much. I really hope to see all of you also tomorrow, and thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good afternoon, Sheldon, and good evening, all of you.